Greetings, friends of liberty. In the spirit of Adam Smith and his magnificent observations about political economy, such as, for example, the role of the division of labor in increasing human productivity enormously, I did want to make one small observation myself, one remark, perhaps of piffling importance, but that has struck me as odd. The matter is this. We here in England, since the time of the Anglo-Saxons, had used firewood overwhelmingly to heat our homes and businesses. So the wood of the horse chestnut, although prone to spit in an open fire, has been used extensively. The wood of the English oak, long burning, is superb. The excellent wood of the hazelnut tree, often coppiced for this very purpose, and many other types of trees such as holly, alder, birch, and hawthorn. The growing problem, however, was that in England, especially around London, so much wood was being used that supplies of firewood were vanishing. So people instead naturally turned to coal to heat their homes and businesses. This transition started in London around 1570 to 1600 and continued throughout the 17th century. Of course, coal smoke, being dirtier than wood, often necessitated installing entirely new stoves and chimneys, but there was nothing else to be done. Now what, after coal, might be England's next source of home heating? Let's cast our minds on the matter, shall we? Might I suggest natural gas? No, not that kind. Throughout ancient times, where practical, natural gas was used, and in England, various mining companies and proprietors of coal mines have used natural gas for heating and lighting. So, for example, at the Whitehaven Colliery in 1727, owner Carlisle Speeding used gas to light his office. And just last year, the same occurred in Cornwall in William Murdoch's office. 'Tis quite possible that, with the increase in general technological proficiency, gas could be used more and more everywhere. Now, assuming that I'm right, and those are better than even odds, what could we conclude economically from these three energy transitions? From wood to coal to potentially natural gas. What we could conclude is that each form of energy is more dense than the other, and thus that we English are getting more and more energy from less and less physical matter by weight. I regard that not as any observation of piffling importance, but instead of profound importance. Now, if we turn to this and similar issues of political economy in your own 21st century throughout the West and even the whole worldwide economy, we find today a book concentrated on just this issue, one of vast importance in understanding the very nature of civilizational progress itself. In More from Less, the surprising story of how we learn to prosper using fewer resources, MIT research scientist Andrew McAfee examines what getting more from less really means for human well-being and whether we can meet the many types of challenges posed by our economic and digital growth. The essential issue is what's called dematerialization. Imagine 100 or 150 years ago, if you wanted to have a big library and could afford it, it might take up 2 or 3 whole rooms. And in order to access your library, depending on how tall the stacks were, you might have to move a ladder around and climb up it just to get a book and start reading it. But today, in a little USB thumb drive, which takes up maybe 1/50,000th of the same space, you could have a library filled with 10 or 20 or 30 times more PDF or Kindle books. And no more climbing ladders. All you have to do is double-click on the book title. And furthermore, to find all the instances of Napoleon mentioned in your entire library, all you have to do is search for that word. So modern digital library represents both a great dematerialization and a vastly increased functionality. McAfee starts by pointing out how wrong in the end the famous 18th century British economist Thomas Malthus was. Malthus had famously argued in his essay on the principle of population that while population increased geometrically, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, the amount of food that can be obtained increased, according to him, only linearly, 2, 3, 4, 5. Fortunately, this was false. However, Malthus, from a superficial point of view, seemed to be right because every historical increase in, for example, the British standard of living had been followed by a population increase which decreased the per capita standard of living. This meant, for example, that while in the year 1400, after the Black Death had killed so many Britons, the standard of living in England for a craftsman was about 130, but 300 years later in the 1700s, it was only 110, 20 less. And so what changed this whole grim calculus? Vastly increased productivity. First, the steam engines of Newcomen and Watt used to power steamships, which traveled, for example, in South America to pick up vast quantities of fertilizer, either the guano found on the Chincha Islands of Peru or the nitrates found in Chile's Atacama Desert. Their application led to vastly increased British, American, and European agricultural productivity, the result being that the British standard of living started shooting skywards from the 1840s onward. By some measures, social development increased 50% in the 19th century and 400% in the 20th. And after steam, what discoveries constituted the next energy transition? Electricity, revolutionizing lighting and power generation everywhere, along with the internal combustion engine, with those Germans, Daimler and Benz, inventing the motor car, and secondly, the German chemists, Haber and Bosch, inventing the ability to synthesize nitrogen fertilizer from the air alone. So where human population previously had taken 200,000 years to reach 1 billion people worldwide, it took 125 years to reach 2 billion, 35 years to reach 3 billion, and only 15 to reach 4 billion. So much, in the end, for Malthus's arithmetic. Of course, one of the results of all this industrial activity was more pollution. The greatest amounts of pollution previously had occurred during the heights of the Roman Empire from 25 to 175 AD with increased mining and lead smelting. But with this new industrialization in Britain, air pollution at times became increasingly very unhealthy. So much so that in 1952, with the Great Smog from December 4th to 9th, likely over 5,000 people died as the sulfur fumes, due to local weather patterns, failed to disperse from the Greater London area. Parliament responded to the disaster with the Clean Air Act of 1956. And in the US, when lead was banned from paint and gasoline, the concentration of that element in the blood of young children dropped by more than 80% between 1976 and 1999. On the positive side, the enormous increases in agricultural activity called forth by the Green Revolution started by agronomist Norman Borlaug of the Rockefeller Foundation, confounded all the liberal green naysayers like Paul Ehrlich, who predicted hundreds of millions dead by starvation in India and other third world countries. The happy reality instead was vastly increased agricultural production with the ability to feed hundreds of millions more mouths. And dematerialization continued through all of society. First, with buildings becoming lighter yet stronger, and with metals such as aluminum, copper, gold, and many others being used much less throughout the economy. Secondly, with agricultural fertilizer and water use declining, even as productivity continued to shoot upwards. And even though so much acreage was abandoned by farmers and given back to nature that the amount of cropland in 1992 was almost back to where it had been almost 25 years before. With milk production in 1950, we got 117 billion pounds from 22 million cows. In 2015, we got 209 billion from just 9 million animals. Thus, the average milk cow's productivity improved by over 330%. Finally, after the fracking revolution, greenhouse gas emissions declined as well, partly because when fracking made natural gas much cheaper, total demand for coal in the United States went down, even though its price decreased. As McAfee summarizes, we have not as a society embraced degrowth. Instead, we've done something far stranger and more profound. We've decoupled growth from resource use. At times, the simple ability of modern society to gather knowledge meant you could be much more efficient with the exact same resources. So, for example, the railroad C&W, by using different methods to keep track of all their railroad cars, painting cars certain colors, using more rail yard spotters, using ID tags, and finally adding all their cars to a computer database, managed to increase their ability to know where any given freight car was from 5% of the time to over 95%, which meant they could use a lot fewer cars and still transport the same amount of freight. Serious dematerialization. Sometimes dematerialization meant simply replacing many devices with one, so a smartphone can photograph, record, web surf, GPS track, and do other functions for which previously many different devices were required. Sort of like the tricorder on Star Trek that could diagnose any sickness. McAfee points out that one of the other advantages of technological progress is that it can simply allow persons to avoid the rights violations that were part of previous technologies. So cell phone technology in Brazil, for example, allows users there to avoid the stifling landline telephone monopoly service and rates imposed on them previously. Similarly, ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft help consumers avoid the expensive taxicab medallion monopoly rates previously found in many American cities. Aside from concentrating on and illustrating the basic fact and principle of dematerialization, McAfee's focus is just as much later on the requisite economic and civilizational background factors that allow dematerialization to occur. Let's review some of these. Number one, McAfee understands capitalism is fundamental to the whole process. Partly, he defines capitalist economies by those having profit-seeking companies, free market entry and competition, strong property rights and contract enforcement, absence of central planning, private ownership of most things, and voluntary exchange. In addition, he agrees that while capitalism can create inequalities, in many cases, that's a good thing, because geniuses like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs are extraordinarily productive and thus deserve having much more. However, he doesn't really point out that unjust inequalities can also occur by governmental privilege, as the just aforementioned example of monopoly medallion yellow cab taxicab companies in many cities, who were allowed to charge outrageous fares. They got rich off of the rest of us before Uber and Lyft destroyed their monopoly. Number two, because he understands that capitalism intrinsically creates more from less, he understands that the concern by many liberals that we'll run out of food or oil or other resources has been proven false time and time again. A typical scaremongering example was his own MIT's 1972 book, The Limits of Growth. In contrast, the economist Julian Simon famously won his bet in 1990 with the doomsdayer Paul Ehrlich about whether 5 popular metals, tungsten, copper, nickel, chromium, and tin, would become more cheaper and abundant over time. They did. Simon won. Number 3, negative externalities. A negative side effect of an activity that imposes a loss of value on others involuntarily is called by economists a negative externality. Negative externalities can be both rights violating and rights respecting. So let's imagine we have a neighborhood and then a factory moves in close by emitting lots of foul-smelling smoke that now makes breathing difficult. That would be a rights violating negative externality. On the other hand, let's imagine we walk down a public sidewalk in the summer and a morbidly obese person comes the other way, his appearance so revolting that we're tempted to turn our heads away in disgust. This will be a rights-respecting negative externality. McAfee says, markets do a lot of important things spectacularly well, but they tend not to take care of negative externalities. So he wants to blame capitalism intrinsically for creating many negative externalities. The near extinction of the bison, the extinction of the passenger pigeon, oil spills in the ocean, overharvesting of whales and fish, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and what concerns him the most, global warming caused by increased CO2 emissions. Let's take these one by one. The first problem is that a lack of knowledge per se about how to protect property rights is not specifically a market failure. That's because markets depend on the accumulation of human knowledge, which happens incrementally. So back in the Stone Age, people hadn't invented writing yet, so they couldn't even write out a contract to trade, for example, 100 cows for 400 chickens. But that failure wasn't a market failure, just a failure at that point in time of human beings to have the societal knowledge to write so they could protect their property rights. That knowledge came later. Additionally, I like the bison and the passenger pigeon as much as anyone, but honestly, I don't regard it as an existential tragedy that there are no more passenger pigeons. Have many people really in the world today, out of the 8+ billion, been made seriously unhappy because there are no passenger pigeons? Of course, as McAfee himself mentions, using genetic engineering, we may be able to recreate something similar soon. Next to the overharvesting of whales and fish. Here we're dealing with the ocean, so the tragedy of the commons sometimes applies, where governments have not set up treaties to prevent overfishing or harvesting. So, for example, when the Soviet Union existed, they deliberately broke whaling treaties to overharvest close to 200,000 whales, often hardly using any of the whale parts at all. Was that a market failure? Or instead a failure of the Soviet government to adhere to signed treaties? In addition, in many areas around the world, governments are starting to create property rights in how many fish fishermen can take. He's specifically mentioning the Martha's Vineyards Fishermen Preservation Trust, which has created a collection of licenses to fish for different types of seafood in the waters around the island. So I'm not sure, again, where the market is failing. And the Great Pacific Garbage Patch has been found to be mainly caused by a few Asian countries dumping all their plastics into the ocean. How, again, is that a market failure? Finally, global warming. The most progress that mankind has made with regard to reducing greenhouse gas emissions was by the discovery, by the free market, of fracking. And this is, of course, as previously mentioned, because natural gas contains less carbon than coal, which it replaced. In the same way, if we want to discover the next step in reducing greenhouse emissions, we want to completely free the markets so they can discover the next new revolutionary energy source. One way of doing that, for example, would be to get the government out of all fusion research and to stop decriminalizing nuclear energy. Completely privatizing energy research and production is the answer. But McAfee, being a modern liberal like Steven Pinker, doesn't understand this. Regarding fracking, he says, we got lucky. No, it's precisely the opposite. By freeing the markets, we allowed mankind to discover the most important breakthrough to fight greenhouse emissions ever made. McAfee's belief in a carbon tax, which is unworkable worldwide, and his belief in unreliable and high-cost wind and solar energies demonstrates his failure to understand how bad government solutions have been. The fate of humanity, if global warming turns out to be severe, may rest, contrary to McAfee, on privatizing everything. Incidentally, he also doesn't recognize that global greening, which is occurring throughout the world, was stimulated by increased CO2 emissions. That's an excellent phenomenon. In conclusion, I would give this a BB+. McAfee makes some of the mistakes you would expect from a liberal working in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but otherwise he describes the process of dematerialization very well and understands overall the power of capitalism to constantly drive human knowledge and civilization forward. Eager for my part, here in 18th century England, to hopefully discover in the not-too-distant future what our next, even more profitable form of energy will be, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.